One of the most profound, if not the most profound, of the numerous post-Ascension appearances of the risen Jesus occurred in Assisi, Italy, in the 13th century, when he appeared to the man we now call Saint Francis, and who is known as the founder of the Franciscan order. Dante, Giotto, Michelangelo are Franciscans. A son was born into the world. With these words in the Divine Comedy, Dante alludes to Francis's birth. His contemporaries viewed him in messianic terms, thinking that he blazed a trail of light for our ascension. Born Giovanni di Pietro Bernardoni, Francis was raised in wealth and privilege by a father who was a cloth trader. He awoke from the dream of his upbringing and, like Jacob, traded his rich clothes and began the quest for the right clothes to scale the ladder to heaven. He was known as the gentle saint who spoke with birds, tamed wolves, and who turned Europe upside down. Pope Benedict called him a giant among holy men. His life arc took him from a life of wealth and privilege to self-chosen material poverty and on to the highest spiritual heights. Francis became known as Jesus' brother and the second Christ to his followers. One reason why is because it is claimed that he lived the Sermon on the Mount better than anyone else. The Sermon on the Mount is the most famous sermon Jesus gave and his most esoteric. In it, he delivers the Beatitudes, or 8 ascending steps towards attaining the blessedness of a divine life. However, the recorded story of his life, the history of his life, is explicit enough in telling us that Francis's extraordinary spiritual experiences matched those which were the goal of the Essenes. He not only lived a life based on the Beatitudes, which were based on Essene teaching, but he also had an encounter with a seraphim, the same angels the Essenes claimed to be living with. In fact, Francis's title, the second Christ, was bequeathed upon him by a contemporary biographer after he became the first person to receive the Stigmata, the 5 wounds of the crucified Christ. This happened through a profound mystical encounter with an apparition of Jesus who appeared to Francis as a seraph angel. During this encounter, Jesus beamed 5 rays of light into Francis's flesh, one for each of the 5 wounds Jesus endured during the crucifixion. Adding to the intrigue of this event is the fact that the Franciscans have been named as the protectors of the Arma Christi, or the artifacts of Jesus. To me, John Van Eyck's version of the stigmatization of St. Francis, which we're looking at here, is perhaps the most stunning. As we have discussed, the seraphim exist in the exact same state of being as the resurrected Christ. They are light beings. The seraph Jesus is strikingly similar to this 4th or possibly 10th century Egyptian Christian image from the Nubian Museum in Aswan, Egypt. Whether it's from the 4th or 10th century, it doesn't matter. This is evidence that some early Christians, before the time of Francis of Assisi in the 13th century, saw the risen Jesus as a seraph. As the saying goes, behind every great man is an even greater woman. In Jesus' life, it was Mary Magdalene. In Padmasambhava's life, it was Yeshe Shogrial, his female disciple. In Francis's life, this was Clare. The luminous one, Saint Clare of Assisi, was also born into a wealthy Italian family, but soon also shunned her luxurious upbringing to embrace the life of piety and enlightenment. When Clare was 18, Francis of Assisi came to preach in the church of St. Giorgio at Assisi. Inspired by his words, Clare asked Francis to help her in dedicating her life to God, and he vowed to do so. The following year, Claire's parents chose a wealthy young man for Claire to marry, but she pointedly refused, fleeing soon after to the Porzincola Chapel, where Francis received her. She took vows, dedicating her life to God, and that moment, occurring on March 20th, 1212, marked the beginning of the Second Order of St. Francis. The group became known for their austere and devout lifestyle and for their power of their prayer, which is credited with saving Assisi from invaders twice. Stories tell how Francis and Claire would retire to the woods near Assisi to converse with each other. The villagers of Assisi, seeing a red glow over the forest, ran with buckets of water to douse what they assumed was a fire. Instead, they found Francis and Claire seated in a clearing, wrapped in conversation, surrounded by a holy fire. So now, let's return to the story of how Francis received the Stigmata. St. Bonaventure, in his Life of St. Francis, describes Francis as being more inflamed than usual with the love of God as he began a special time of solitary prayer at Laverna in September of 1224. His unquenchable fire of love for the good Jesus, Bonaventure writes, was fanned into such a blaze of flames that many waters could not quench so powerful a love. Bonaventure goes on, while Francis was praying on the mountainside, he saw a seraph with 6 fiery and shiny wings descend from the height of heaven. And when, in swift flight, the seraph had reached a spot in the air near the man of God, there appeared between the wings the figure of a man crucified, with his hands and feet extended in the form of a cross and fastened to a cross. 2 of the wings were lifted above his head, 2 were extended for flight, and 2 covered his whole body. While Francis saw this, he was overwhelmed, and his heart was flooded with a mixture of joy and sorrow. He rejoiced because of the gracious way Christ looked upon him under the appearance of a seraph. But the fact that he was fastened to a cross pierced his soul with the sword of compassionate sorrow. It is said that whoever lays eyes on a seraph, he would be instantly incinerated due to the immense brightness of the seraph. That may be true for some. For others, especially the awakened, contact with a seraph results not in incineration, but rather transference of a divine energy and transformation into a seraph. This is what Francis experienced. In fact, Renaissance thinkers, taking up Francis's mantle, believed humans can transform into seraphim by meditating on the love of the Creator. In fact, that is our highest human aspiration. In a moment of what scholars call seraphic ecstasy, Francis, who had sought to imitate Christ in all things, actually received the marks of crucifixion on his body. As St. Bonaventure acknowledges and lends support for, writing in his book, The Major Legend of St. Francis, through the Stigmata, the true love of Christ transformed the lover into his image. When the vision disappeared, writes Bonaventure, Francis was left with a marvelous ardor in his heart, a new frequency, a new vibration. And at the same time, there were imprinted on his body markings that were no less marvelous. These markings were the Stigmata, and after receiving the Stigmata, Francis became known by his contemporaries as the Second Christ. One needs to analyze their own heart and what happens to their heart when they truly love something or someone to comprehend the statement, the true love of Christ transformed the lover into his image. One can only presume to imagine the ecstasy a holy man like Francis must have felt were he touched by the full spectrum rainbow light body or resurrection body of Jesus. It makes no difference whether he imagined the experience, hallucinated it, or physically experienced it. An exchange of energy took place. A transformation occurred as a result. That's what counts. We need to know that Francis is also connected with an astounding Merkabah story. Once, he traveled into Assisi while his brethren remained at a hut in the outskirts of town. Late that evening, while Francis was praying at an isolated garden within the town, the friars back in the countryside witnessed an astonishing sight. At about midnight, a fiery chariot with a globe of light resting above suddenly appeared. This bright chariot of fire took 2 or 3 laps here and there about the room, twisting around and about in their hut. It rested on a large globe, shining like the sun, illuminating the dark night. It's obviously similar to the Merkabah chariot of Ezekiel, of Elijah, and Jesus, who we have previously discussed. The friars were amazed by not only the light that enters the body, but also in the spirit, which had extraordinary effects. The brilliant light astoundingly made their hearts and souls completely clear to each other. They all glanced about and immediately developed a wonderful understanding that although their spiritual father, Francis, was physically absent, he was miraculously present in this dazzling apparition. Stories like this of Francis popping into his light body and riding a Merkabah chariot must have circulated around Italy and Europe. This would in part explain why the Franciscan order grew so rapidly. More, Francis's ascetic way of life, his deep respect for nature, and his devotion to the poor reflect absolutely the Cathar way of life. It greatly appealed to the people of Italy as tens of thousands quickly joined Francis's way. Francis had for them a simple formula for saving mankind: the imitation of Christ and brotherly love. Francis went on to transform the church by refocusing Christians on the gospel, not on the church. He taught his followers to obey the gospel, the words of Jesus, to care for the suffering, to preach and to embrace poverty as their bride. Again, to embrace the promise of the light body rather than the promise of earthly pleasures. As the Mahayana Buddhists have the 6 paramitas or practices that lead to perfection, being generosity, morality, patience, diligent effort, contemplation, and insight, so too did Francis have 6 practices that lead to ascension. The first is friendship. The second was embracing the other. He saw the sacred in everyone and everything. He advocated poverty. He renounced wealth, power, and control. Being poor, Francis's way, meant to reduce the effects of karma on one's ascension. Spirituality. Francis showed people how to live spiritual lives all the time, not just in church. Care. Francis taught that all of God's creation must be cared for. He poetically called the sun his brother and the moon his sister. He is the subject of the prayer of St. Francis: Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. And it's for this reason that he has become today's environmental saint. Death. Francis taught his followers to welcome death, the promise of the afterlife in a light body. When Francis died, one of the brethren saw his soul, which was now freed from his body, winging its way towards heaven, surrounded by a white cloud. He said it looked like a bright shining star. This is a perfect description of the Merkabah throne or Ascension throne of Christ. After his death, Clare continued his work and broadened her own influence. She died in 1253 and was canonized 2 years later by Pope Alexander IV. Works such as Giotto's Apotheosis of St. Francis or Vasari's St. Francis in Glory illustrate the belief that he ascended to heaven and now sits on the Ascension throne. This means that Francis of Assisi fulfilled the ultimate mission of the Essenes, the Cathars, the Manichaeans, and all the other Ascension keepers we've been discussing. Francis's story is a powerful story of transformation. He was an ordinary person like you and I, who received a revelation, in this case through a work of art, followed the path of this message, and gradually, step by step, began to embrace the transformative powers of that original message and embraced his ascended self. All of us might not need to go to the extremes that Francis took. In his life, he made a very powerful statement about taking off any of the robes of wealth. But maybe in our time, we're meant to use this incredible abundance that our world has offered to us as a stepping stone to our own ascension. And in this way, Francis's message is that no matter what our life circumstance, whether we come from poverty or from great wealth, we all can embrace the path of ascension, which is the way of love, and ascend into the celestial realms.